Before we discuss that, let us first see what does it mean to be a spiritual person. What constitutes a spiritual person and differentiates that person from, let's say, someone who does not practice spirituality or does not practice spirituality by any conscious efforts. In order to reply to that, we would have to first of all acknowledge that no one is more spiritual than another. All beings are spiritual. All matter is spiritual. Doesn't matter what degree of density it is composed of. Every stone is just as spiritual as a much more active element like water or fire. It's just in its inert state, maybe its level of awareness is at such low point, that it's just a stone, just a piece of rock. However, it does not mean that that piece of rock is devoid of consciousness. Whence it is not devoid of spirituality. Many indigenous people have understood that in many indigenous societies, objects were embedded with as much spiritual powers as beings themselves, as human beings. So going back to us as collective consciousness, as community, as individuals, we all practice spirituality to a different degree. Even if we're not fully aware of that, it's impossible otherwise, because the word spirituality comes from the root of the word spirit, and spirit stands for the essence. What spirituality is, it's the conscious effort towards establishing connection with one's own essence. That's what spirituality in essence is. It's the essence of the essence. And the degree of spirituality is measured by one primal factor, or by one primal experience: the awareness of the being towards any experience that that being undergoes. No matter what that experience is, the awareness is that factor which tells us of the level of that being's spirituality. So if someone is born with the profound state of awareness, that being may not even be involved in any formal practice such as yoga, meditation, Reiki, what have you, Tai Chi, or any practice that is kind of known today in the New Age world as being spiritual. That being is naturally abides in his or her own spirit, because that being is embedded with a profound state of awareness. The awareness does not leave that person. And with the awareness comes all those spiritual qualities that we call spiritual, because they are byproducts often of practiced spirituality. But we would come to that later. So all these qualities, such as compassion, sensitivity, love, tremendous appreciation of life at all its levels, understanding of the multi-layered complexity of life, understanding that nothing is as it is. All these are the signs of evolved awareness. In relation to someone who practices spirituality, I would say that comparisons are often not in favor of establishing any correlation whatsoever. Because what are we comparing here? Someone says, oh, so and so has been meditating for so and so many years, so and so has been practicing yoga, but they're still full of ego, full of, you know, their own stuff, you know, they're still tripping, they're still doing this, they're still getting angry, they're still getting upset, they're still getting attached. Fine. You know, who are we to judge? What is the legitimate platform that allows us to give a qualitative measure of that person's progress? I think it's a very thin ground we stand on when we do that. So I'd say that spirituality in a being is not measured, of course, by the hours that person spends in the yoga class or on the mat meditating, stretching, or, you know, or repeating mantras and, you know, chanting. Of course, all these technologies do help if those technologies allow the self-referral quality of consciousness shine through the limitations of this corporal reality we know as the body. However, everyone is embedded with different experiences, and everyone has different degree of density when it comes to realizing one's full potential. So it's not up to us to say that that person is not affected by spiritual practice. It is not affected in relation to our viewpoint, in relation to our perspective. But our perspective is often subjected to our own limitations and our own progress. So it's like a little bit, you know, I remember, I'm not a fan of Osho, but in fact I even written some critical essays on Osho's methodology of teaching. But he's fun, and he's great when it comes to the kind of like giving the aspirant at the early stage of his or her journey that kind of nice slap, nice kick, you know. And I remember when Osho was asked by an aspirant, isn't the enlightened being also has the ego? And how does an unenlightened being, let's say someone who is ignorant, would know that he has met enlightened being? And Osho's reply was, when ignorant person sees an enlightened being, he sees his own ego reflected in that being. When an enlightened being sees an ignorant being, he sees his own light in that being, even if concealed by the temporal covering of the ego. It's more or less like that. You know, this is, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not giving any quotes. So it is often the case when we view another person's limitations, when we view another person's, so to speak, faulty behavior, let's not forget that that faulty behavior may be a reflection of our own that we recognize in the other, because we are in the hall of mirrors, constantly reflecting each other. We have to be very careful when we do that, because also, as somebody who practices meditation, as those who have this kind of like spiritual practice ingrained in our activity, our perception becomes more powerful. It's another subject altogether, it's much more profound subject, and perhaps we will talk about it separately. Yet let us not forget that when we pass a qualitative judgment, even in our thought, that judgment comes from a perspective of amplified judgment, because it belongs to the one who is already developed some kind of level of spiritual practice. So we're magnifying the quality, you know, we're literally using a magnifying glass, and by virtue of seeing those qualities that are of positive register, we acknowledging the goodness that we have been recognizing outwardly as our own. It's quite simple but quite subtle, and we should not fail to recognize the difference between seeing an utterly wrong action of the other or just a kind of perceptual distortion through the mirror of or a lens of our own perspective. So this is how I view it. Now, going back to those who have been born with a profound level of awareness, with the kind of gift of self-referral state of consciousness, do they need to practice any spirituality? The answer to that is yes. Why? Because you don't know what's around the corner. Our life is bombarded with experience on a daily basis. And although certain experiences may be digested there and then and not leaving much impression in our psyche, other experiences may be more harder to digest, and spiritual practice of a gifted aspirant, of a gifted being, will only give that reassurance, give that extra stability in life, because it will disallow any impressions entering too deep into the nervous system to become the stresses, which will only create the possibility for identification with that experience and, as a result, with the loss of self-awareness. Whence, even for someone who came into this world, spiritual practice is a must. And history is full of examples, like when Anandamayi Ma was born, as a child she exhibited signs of a saint right from the moment she started to walk and speak, so to speak. However, she has undergone through a formal spiritual sadhana for 12 years, only if to be able to relate the process to her future disciples and followers, because one could say that although she was a saint from birth, she nevertheless needed that practice to stabilize what was already there in the first place, to turn it into yet another qualitative measure. So for someone who, let's say, known as a living embodiment of goodness, I would say that spiritual practice would be like, an icing on the cake. So why to deny oneself such luxury? Because that luxury then would be spilled over and shared with the others. Why? That luxury, that delicacy would be shared with the others. It would be savored by all those who will partake in the company of the one who has an inborn quality of heart, only cultured to a supreme refinement of a spiritually awakened being.